good afternoon, and good morning. I know we have alumni dialing in from various parts of the world. I'm Professor Ratika Gore. I'm an alumnus myself and currently handling alumni relations for the Institute. So, welcome to SPGMR Alumni Webinar Series. Um, we have had such an encouraging response from our alumni community, not just from different parts of the world. Alumni have registered across batches and across programs. So the agenda today is very simple. Dr. Banerjee will speak for around 35-40 minutes. And then there'll be an alumnus who will moderate the Q&A round. Her name is Soumya Tripathi. She is a student of marketing, PGDM exiting batch of 2018, currently area manager Delhi at Colgate Palmolive, ex-student of mine, and a first bencher in any class for marketing and economics. So now I will request Dr. Banerjee to come in. I know he needs no introduction. He's a speaker par excellence. Over to you, Dr. Banerjee.
Thank you. And I think, Ratika, thanks for pointing out to me that I need to say good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, depending on the time zones. So there's a good and there's a bracket in between. We're going to talk about behavioral economics, which is a subject at the intersection of psychology and economics. And I'm going to break up this talk into broadly two parts. The first part where I will introduce you to the subject of behavioral economics, give you some business examples. And in the second part, I will try to extend behavioral economics to the complex situation that all of us find ourselves in today and look at if we can relate it to some tips in terms of how we behave, how we communicate, how we build habits. So behavioral economics, put simply, is the science of how human beings make mistakes. And for a long time, including today, the dominant theory of how human beings make mistakes is that how human beings make decisions is that we are rational. And what rationality means is it kind of assumes that we know exactly what we are doing. And essentially, we do what is good for us. This has been the dominant theory because there are still a large number of situations in which we do seem to behave as though we are rational. For instance, you give people two options, one in which they earn less money, one in which they earn more money. Most people will pick the option in which they earn more money. When you cross the road, you can cross the road in a way that you will get killed. You can cross the road in a way that you will survive. 99.9% of people will cross the road in a way that they will survive. And these are all small examples of rationality. Now, if you think, however, on a day-to-day basis, there are a large number of examples of ways in which we do not practice rationality. Very, very simple. We take a loan out at 13% on a house or an asset, and we keep a large amount of money in savings or current accounts at 6%. Clearly earning lower interest, clearly we're paying higher interest, that goes on. We commit ourselves to expensive diet plans, but we have the chocolate at 10 p.m. in the night. Clearly another example. You go with one shopping list, but you go to the counter and there's this impressive list of well-packaged items. Just as you're finishing your shopping bit, you end up buying more than you had planned for. So examples of irrationality abound. But the point is that up to a certain point, rationality was the dominant theory, because when the psychologist said that, look, human beings are emotional, human beings make mistakes, the economists could always come back to them and say, yeah, but I have a theory, and that theory explains 85%. All you guys have are exceptions. And that was when, with Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, when they talked about a phenomenon called reference dependence, and they won the Nobel Prize for their paper on reference dependence. That was when behavioral economists started creating an alternative theory. I'm not going to talk to you much about the theory. I'm going to jump in quickly and kind of show you what this is about. Can everybody see the slide? Can you see this?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the science of how human beings make mistakes. So this is a trivial kind of cartoon. It says that here is somebody who's come up with the wheel, and there are a bunch of people who are dragging the wheelbarrow, and they're essentially saying, no thanks, we are too busy, and the wheel goes kind of unutilized. So just a small example of irrationality, but from this point in time, what I want you to do is I want you to kind of look at the slide and look at the options I'm proposing, and then into the chat, maybe if you can give me options. Imagine that the US is preparing for the outbreak of an unusual disease, which is expected to kill 600 people. Two alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed. Assume that the exact scientific estimates of the consequences as follows. If program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. If program B is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved and a 2/3 probability that no one will be saved. Can you just quickly put into the chat whether your preference is A or B? Okay, so very quickly, in this case, most people choose program A. Most people choose program A. Now, I'm quickly going to go to the next slide. Imagine that the US is preparing for the outbreak of an unusual disease, which is expected to kill 600 people. Two alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed. Assume the exact scientific estimates of the consequences are as follows. If program A is adopted, 400 people will die. If program B is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that nobody will die and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. What is your choice in this case? Okay. There are people who have stayed with A. Many people have moved with B. Some people with some exposure and looking more carefully are saying both are the same. In this case, most of the people tend to select B. Now let's look at this a little carefully. Imagine that the US is preparing. It says there's a disease which is expected to kill 600 people. In the first case, it says if program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. In the second case, it says if program A is adopted, 400 people will die. Now, when you read it a little carefully, if 600 people exist and 200 people are saved, then 400 people will die. So the two options are the same. However, by framing one in terms of death and framing another in terms of lives saved, the decision can be changed. And this is the fundamental tenet of behavioral economics, which is what? People do not take decisions in terms of absolute values. They always take decisions relative to a reference point. And by changing the reference point, the decision can be changed. Okay, there are some hands up. I think I just want to state that I'm going to go through with interaction for 35 minutes and we will have Q&A after that. So I will not be able to take questions in between. So what you have just now seen is an example where you had two alternatives. They were essentially the same choices, but the alternatives were framed differently. And by framing differently, for many of the people, you change the decisions. I'm now going to put a similar thing now with money in the chat window. And essentially, I'm saying now, supposing you had option A, which was 5,000 rupees for sure, and option B, zero, heads or tails. Essentially, I take a coin. It's not a Sholay coin. So I take a coin. If the coin comes up heads, I give you 10,000. If the coin comes up zero, I give you, if the coin comes up tails, I give you 0. Question is very simple. What do you select? Very, very quickly. Okay, all A's. So this is a case. Okay, we'll stop here. There are some B's, which are people who are risk seeking. Essentially, they make good gamblers. So now what we are saying is, we gave you two options. Both had an expected gain of 5,000, but one was a risky choice in the sense that you could get 10,000 or 0, and you could get 5,000 for sure. People are risk averse in the domain of gains. That is, when I'm presented with a risky choice and a riskless choice with an equivalent payoff, then it is the riskless choice that gets preferred. Now I'm going to just, it does depend, Sandeep, on risk-taking ability, but what we are talking about is what happens in the average. Now I'm just going to change this around and say, in the first case, it is minus 5,000, and in the second case, it is minus 10,000 or 0. So in the first case, there is a loss of 5,000 for sure. In the second case, I toss a coin. And if the coin comes up heads, you give me 10,000. If the coin comes up tails, you give me 0. All people select the second case. People are risk averse in the domain of gains and risk seeking in the domain of losses. Now, what would be interesting is that if you were to start off at a bank balance of 10,000, and I offered you the first case, that is plus 5,000, plus 10,000, and plus 0. And in the second case, if you were to start off at plus 20,000, minus 10,000, minus 0, minus 5,000, the net options will be the same. But by changing your starting point, I can make you change your decision. I'm going to quickly go back, but this is the essence of behavioral economics. One, we do not take decisions with regard to absolute values. We always take them to a reference point or a standard of comparison. And in India, of course, it starts very early. When you come home in the fourth standard with 93 in math, and you tell your parent, I got 93, your parent does not say 93 good, 93 bad, your parent says what was the highest, right? So there is always a standard of comparison, and you always judge the value of outcomes. So, a good question which I often ask at this point in time is, can you think of any decision that you make where there is no reference point? You can use the chat. Can you think of any decision that you make where there is no reference point? Okay. So there are many good attempts, from marriage and love to health to political decisions. If I had more time, I could systematically show you that there is a reference point for each. So for instance, one of the nicest ones I've got in a class when somebody told me that love at first sight is a great example of no reference points. Then of course my response was, how is it that when you go to college, so many of the guys fall in love at first sight with the same girl? And the reason is obviously that there is a reference point for beauty, which is society created. So if you think deeply enough, it is very, very difficult to find a decision where there is no reference point. And in fact, it goes further. Very often we find that when there is no reference point, we try to create a reference point. We often need a standard of comparison. And that's why this stuff is important. It's not only Indians, it is across the world. This is globally proven. And it is quite interesting that a bulk of what we teach in business schools still does not explicitly mention reference dependence, because it influences your day-to-day behavior in a very big way. There are people who have raised hands. You can write the questions in the chat and we'll try to take care of them. I'm going to go back to the slide. Can everybody see the slide? So this is what we are saying so far. People do not evaluate outcomes in absolute terms, but relative to a reference point. They are risk averse in gains, but risk seeking in losses. Now, what I'm going to do with this is come up with certain examples or business applications. Most of these are actual experiments. So they took a group of school teachers, and you're all familiar with performance appraisal systems. And when you look at reference dependence, there are really three things. One is people are risk averse in gains, risk seeking in losses. People don't evaluate decisions in absolute terms. It's relative to a reference point. And the third is people dislike losing more than they like winning. So if it's minus 5,000 and plus 5,000, it is not an even gamble, because the negative of minus 5,000 is larger to me than the positive of plus 5,000. I dislike losing, and research has suggested that I dislike losing around twice as much. So minus 2,500 and plus 5,000 would make people actually accept the gamble. So this is an example. They did it with school teachers. Just look at a performance appraisal system and think of a performance appraisal system where I say 3 on 5, $3,000, 4 on 5, $4,000, 5 on 5, $5,000. I will judge your performance at the end of the year and give you money. So case one, I do it like this. I go to one group of teachers and I say $3,000 if your appraisal rating is 3, 4,000 if your appraisal rating is 4, 5,000 if your appraisal rating is 5. I go to another group and I say, I know you're good. You're all going to get $4,000 at the end of the year because I know you're going to achieve a 4 rating. So I give you $4,000 upfront. At the end of the year, your ranking is 4, my ranking is 4, you're happy, I'm happy. End of the year, your ranking is 5, my ranking is 4, I give you 1,000 more. End of the year, your ranking is 3, you give me $1,000 back. Which worked best? Which of these two schemes got the better result? Okay, okay. Very good. So there are many A's and many B's. A's seem to dominate. The actual data seems to suggest that the first one works better. And the reason it works better is simply that people are loss averse. That when I have the 4,000, I don't want to lose it. So I work harder to not give money back because, speaking simply, people dislike losing more than they like winning. Of course, there are many problems with applying this in the real world. And one of the biggest problems might be you pay the person $4,000 and they leave in the middle of the year. There may be other issues. They've invested or they spent the 4,000, so that puts more pressure on them to work on it. But this is just one example of an application. Okay, I'm going to give 2 or 3 more applications and then I'm going to get into the COVID scenario. This is a very famous example. It's called anchoring. 55 students at MIT were asked to jot down the last 2 digits of their social security number. And then they were asked to guess prices of objects whose prices they presumably did not know. Now, essentially what is happening is I'm writing down 2 digits. I'm seeing those 2 digits in front of me. And when I'm seeing those 2 digits in front of me, I know that the last 2 digits of my social security number have no relation to the object whose price I'm guessing. So basically, these last 2 digits should not matter. Okay. Now, what happens? When you look at people who had the last 2 digits of their social security number between 0 and 19, their average guess was $8.64. When you look at people whose last 2 digits were between 80 and 99, their average guess was $26.18. And this is a linear progression. So if you look at 21 to 40, it's more than 8, less than 26, around 12. If you look at 41 to 60, it goes to 16. If you look at 60 to 80, it goes to 20. So let me just stop the share at this point in time. And I will actually, Ratika, can we allow people to speak? No, so I put it in chat.
I have around almost 250 plus, so I would avoid, but I'll leave it to you.
No. So
Chat is a better one.
can you just put in the chat, why do you think this happens? Can anybody put in the chat, why do you think happens? It's absolutely crazy, right? I've got this random number in front of me. Okay, so if your answer is anchoring, you've already been through the phenomenon. So try and explain anchoring to me. Try and explain anchoring to me. Okay, so Karan says at least some reference point is there, which is a good answer. Unconscious anchoring is a very good answer. Our minds get a subconscious direction. So essentially, it's like this. I do not know the price. Okay, and that I do not know the price is critical to this experiment. I look down at the paper in front of me and I have written down 90. I know that that 90 is unrelated to the price, but that 90 is available. So I start saying, no, 90 is too high. It will be much lower than 90. But when I start adjusting from 90. Now, somebody else who has 30 written on their desk has got 30 and he says 30 is large. But now they're adjusting downwards from 30 and the result is different. Now, the video is a little patchy. There was a video I would have liked to show you at this point in time, but let me just tell you the story of the video. You can go to YouTube after this session and see iPad launched by Steve Jobs. Now, when the iPad was launched, the iPad was not a desktop, nor was it a laptop. It was a category in between. There was a lot of hype. There was a rumor that the iPad was going to be priced at $999. There was a rumor that the iPad was going to be priced at $999. It did not come from Apple. Apple did not deny. Apple did not accept. Then Steve Jobs goes to the iPad launch and he puts up a slide and he says, if I listen to the pundits on what the iPad should be priced at, you are saying $9.99. And he puts up a slide with $9.99. And then he says, I'm thrilled to tell you that with cost reductions, innovation, the price of the iPad is not $9.99, but $4.99. And a group of analysts, cynical analysts, starts to clap. And $499, which was the price, was close to the laptop price at that point in time. So they got everybody to think about $999, anchored it. And remember, this can be done well only for relatively new products, and we're still not got into the ethics of this. We're just explaining the phenomena, we're explaining some potential applications, and then we will kind of build further. Soumya, I'll go a little bit further and then I'm going to take a few questions. So similar example on wine, price of 1996 Hermitage wine, those with 0 to 19 says $11.70, 80 to 19 says $37.55. Okay, this is a lovely example. Many of you may be working in FMCG. Consider two FMCG schemes where a child buys a chocolate, eats the chocolate. If you eat a chocolate, you get a stamp. In the first case, I give you a stamp book with 8 stamps to fill in. So you, 1 chocolate, 1 stamp, fill in, get 8 chocolates, you fill in 1 page, you get a gift. Scheme number 1. Scheme number 2, I give you a stamp book where 1 page has 10 stamps. But now the difference is, I fill in 2 stamps and give it to you. So you have to collect 10 stamps, but the manufacturer already fills in 2 stamps and gives it to you. Now, again, you have to eat 8 more chocolates. You fill in 8 more chocolates, the 10 stamps are complete, and you get your prize. So 8 stamps, 0 filled in, 10 stamps, 2 filled in. Both are schemes, both involve exactly 8 chocolates. Which scheme works better? Which scheme works better and why? Okay, you move to A's and B's. So the 10 stamps works better. Why does the 10 stamps work better? Because very simply, when you have a large target, the best way is to make the target look smaller. You already start at 20% achievement. And then the child is thinking, I already have 2 stamps. If I don't fill it up, I will lose the 2 stamps value that I have. People dislike losing more than they like winning. And people dislike losing more than they like winning. I'm going to give you 2 more examples and then I'll take, so the actual data is 18% for the scheme 1 and 34%. And obviously this has huge marketing applications, huge applications in scheme design, promotion design, etc. Okay, this is crazy. If you follow the NBA, an analysis was done of basketball games, hundreds of basketball games. And it was found that teams which were trailing by 1 point at halftime were significantly more likely to win the game than teams which were winning by 1 point at halftime. Now, it has to be a 1 point difference because the teams have to be equally matched. If it's a large difference, then one team is better than the other, it does not work. But essentially, when you are trailing by 1 point at halftime and the teams are almost equal, the team which is trailing by 1 point seems to come out with much more intensity. And that seems to affect the result. I've shared this with a lot of sportsmen. It seems very surprising, but many of them actually buy it. So it's a remarkable fact because it's from secondary data and it's actually revealed from secondary data. Maybe I'll close this segment with one last kind of point, and which is to say, which do you think is the single largest channel for sale of Rolls-Royce in the United Kingdom? And it's an application of anchoring. Which do you think is the sales channel through which the largest sales of Rolls-Royce is done in the United Kingdom? Okay. So Sumit Saxena says impulse sales. Somebody who's been through the class before knows the answer. Dealers, word of mouth. Okay. So the answer is very simple. The largest single channel for yacht shows. Okay, golf course. Gaurav Jain says golf course. That's a great guess. The right answer is yacht shows. Essentially, think of all these multi-billionaires going to buy a 100 crore yacht. And maybe they don't get the yacht they like. And as they are coming by, they see a Rolls Royce at 5 crores and they say, I couldn't get a yacht, but I might as well pick up a Rolls Royce. Because when you've anchored at 100 crores, 5 crores doesn't seem like a lot of money. So it's a surprising thing. We find this in real data. So I'm going to stop here, and this is kind of an overview on the behavioral economics part of it, which is the standard kind of thing where you're looking at multiple phenomena, and we teach a whole course. But systematic irrationality, people take decisions relative to a reference point. Reference points are subjective, and hence reference points can be manipulated by marketers, by businessmen, etc. Second is reference points and their presence are a barrier to decision making for all of us, because all of us are subject to these mistakes. Should I take questions? One or two questions just on this part and then kind of jump on for the next part?
Sure, Ranjan sir. So I'll just tell you a few of the questions that came in. So probably to everyone who's attending, if you want to ask questions basis this section, probably you can post it. I'll just take it up. So one question that came in from Ashish was on the social security number example that you gave. And he asked that now that we know this concept that you just told us about anchoring and reference point, how can we avoid getting influenced in such a scenario?
The point is a lot of these decisions are unconscious. But one of the things to do is whenever you see a large number that seems too good to be true, just probe it a little further. Very, very simple example of anchoring. Up to 50% off. Every second retail store will have, at season time, will have something called up to 50% off. Just walk into the store and say, out of 100 items in that store, how many does this discount apply to? So one of the ways is to just probe it a little bit further. The other way is that when you look at these anchoring examples, the thing to realize is that the products are chosen such that you have little information. The trackball mouse is a weird one. The brand of wine is a weird one. So whenever students have, or whenever customers have alternative reference points, or if you're not sure, if you check back with somebody who's an expert and create a more informed reference point, that can be one way of preventing it. But the problem with a lot of this is that it is irrational, it is quick, and it often happens because we don't have time and we take the first decision. There are many, many examples, but one of the simplest things is, let's say, I say an exercise facility, okay? An exercise facility says that you have a monthly membership at 5,000 rupees. And you have a pay per view or pay per use of 500 rupees. So monthly membership 5,000, pay per use 500. Now what is the rational thing? If you are somebody who's going to exercise more than 10 times a month, you must take the monthly. If you are somebody who thinks they're going to exercise less than 10, you must take the per use. A large number of people who take the monthly exercise 3 to 4 times a year. Now you go further. You educate them and say, you're on the wrong plan as per your behavior. Only 50% of the people change their behavior because the rest of the people say, this year I will exercise. So the point about this irrationality is that it is persistent, it is irrational, it is predictably irrational. So we not only make mistakes, but we tend to repeat the same mistakes again and again and again.
Sure. Thank you, Ranjan sir. So I'll just pick. So one very tough question I think came at the start, wherein Ankit asked that how does one set reference points for moral decisions or in situations of ethical dilemmas? Something that was asked at the very start of the session.
Yeah, so it's really, really difficult, I think, but I've always used the sleep over it test, that if you sleep over it, and if at the end of the day, when you get up in the morning, you're comfortable with the choice you're thinking of making, that is one way. People also talk about the page one test, which is to say that if the decision that you're going to take is going to be proclaimed to be on page one tomorrow, would you be comfortable with the choice that you're making? That's an alternative of a reference point. Also, what happens often in a moral dilemma is because you're involved, it's very difficult to be objective. So one good test is that if a friend came to you with the same problem and asked you for advice, what advice would you give a friend? Okay, just take the advice you give your friend.
Great, great. So I'll just pick up a few more, and probably the rest we can take at the end once if we have more time.
Yeah,
So a
because
couple of questions on the COVID situation, since must be on people's minds. So one came up wherein
can
it
I
says,
pass on the COVID? Because my next set of slides are behavioral economics and COVID.
sure, okay, so
So I'm
we'll
going to
take that
pass
up
on
later.
the COVID questions for now, because I'm going to give some perspective on a number of COVID situation related things. I'll talk about why we are seeing some of the things that we are seeing, and then I'll take questions. Some of the questions may get answered in that process.
Sure. Another one, which is on anchoring. Can you give an example how this gets used in e-commerce or e-commerce selling sites?
There are many ways in e-commerce, but one of the ways is that discounts are reported on what? Are there discounts? So I can have a suggested retail price and I can have an MRP. If I want to make my discount look higher, I will anchor you at a high discount by comparing it relative to the MRP. So when you look at a discount, what is that discount relative to could be one of the things. The second is that you will typically find that if I want to sell a medium value product, I will place it next to a very high value product. So that when you have bought a high value product and your reference points in terms of what you're willing to pay. So, these are some of the things, and I'm not sure that all of these can be called strictly anchoring. Another thing that you will see is that if I want you to buy tickets, and all the airline seats will do this, airline, I mean, from a time when we used to book tickets on airlines, okay, is 3 seats left or 3 seats left at this price. So I'm anchoring you on a perception of scarcity and creating urgency, and something like that happens all the time. Okay, I'm going to move, just bear with me because I'm going to bring this back to COVID and then take your questions after that.
Sure.
So this was the NBA. Now, I will make the case for how this is related to COVID. Essentially, Martin Seligman did a research on dogs, and Seligman coined this term learned helplessness. And there were two experiments. I'm going to talk to you about the latter experiment. And essentially, there are two dogs in two different chambers. In one of the chambers, the dog gets random shocks, but at a regular frequency, the dog can tap a bar and stop the shock. So the dog is subjected to pain, gets random shocks, but the dog has an element of control in the sense that he can stop the pain by tapping, and he discovers that he can stop the pain. In the second case, the other dog is linked to the first dog, is getting the same shocks, but he has no control over the pain because the pain is stopped by another dog in another chamber whom he cannot see. So essentially, there are two cases. One is the case where there are random incidences of pain or crisis, and I have little control. The other is there are random incidents of pain or crisis, and I have no control. Now, these two dogs are taken from this experiment and put in a cabin where there is a partition. And the idea of the partition is as they get shocks, if they choose and move to explore around, they can avoid the shocks completely. Now, what they find is that the dog who was in the cabin where they had shocks and no control, once they get the shocks, they just lie there. While the dog who had been given an element of control moves around, thrashes around, finds an option, and gets saved. What does this tell us? Essentially, this is the phenomenon of learned helplessness. That when shocks are random, I don't know when they are going to go away, and I have no control, then I feel helpless. And when I feel helpless, I resort to apathy. I resort to complaining about the environment. I resort to stress. And in patriarchal societies with exploitation, it can even get manifested as an increase in physical violence in the household. So the question that I'm now looking at is, think of a leader, or think of a business leader, or think of a politician who has to communicate. Are there principles of how you should communicate when the threat is random? You don't know how long it is going to last, and you don't know exactly what you can do to help people. And that is pretty much the essence of the situation that we find ourselves in. So one of the simplest things is, and you know, I just want you to do this thought experiment for me. Close your eyes for the next 30 seconds and do not think of anything that begins with the letter Z. I want everybody to try to do this. Close your eyes for the next 30 seconds and do not think of anything that begins with the letter Z. Okay, you can open your eyes. On the chat, maybe if you can just tell me what happened when you closed your eyes. On the chat, if you can just tell me what happened when you close your eyes. Okay, I'm not getting anything on the chat.
Ranjan is a lot coming on the chat right now. Mostly what letters starting with E.
Okay, okay. So the point is very simple. The point is, if I tell you not to think of something, it is very difficult to do it because your mind keeps going back to that. Now just think about it. What does this mean when I tell you don't leave home? I cannot change behavior only by telling you to do something. I must find alternative ways for you to do it. And that's why you will find the dominant narrative is not don't leave home. The dominant narrative is stay safe, stay healthy. The dominant narrative is a positive narrative and not a negative narrative. But the larger point is that if you want people to change their behavior, of course, there is one reason that people will obey when you say don't leave home, and that is fear. So the larger motivation is that there is police bandopast, there is curfew, you're rounding off people. But the point is, this is not sustainable in itself, because when you remove the fear, there is a dam that bursts, and that is dangerous. So it's not enough to say don't do this. You have to give people alternatives. Instead of saying don't think about anything with the letter Z, if I say just for the next 30 seconds, I want you to write down as many objects as possible that include milk. Now, milk has no relation to the letter Z, but I've made you do something else. And strangely enough, this is more likely to give you the result you want, that people don't think of anything with the letter Z. I mean, unless you can find a milk derivative which has Z, but that we separate that out. The second is that even if you don't have control, even if it's unpredictable, you have to give people specifics so that they can plan. And what does this mean? Look at the way we've managed our lockdown. We've said 2 weeks and I will let you know after 2 weeks. So people are then planning for a 2-week horizon. So there is a definite science to the way the Prime Minister has been communicating. Another example is tangibles. What is a simple thing? Something as simple as the Prime Minister wearing a mask, putting down the mask and then starting to speak. This is not just the behavior that I'm asking you to do, I am practicing it. And if the Prime Minister of India, the most powerful man, has to protect himself, please protect yourself. So this element of making it tangible, of course, they got it wrong when they had Parliament and Madhya Pradesh and all of that. But later on, you will see the videos that they're now showing of the cabinet ministers practicing social distancing. So they are demonstrating the behavior. Now, what is it that, what more can we do? We encourage people to look at ways to create a sense of control. Which is what, for instance, I have been talking to student groups, alumni groups, and saying, look, this is going to go on for 2 months, this is going to go on for 3 months. If you are at the end of this facing an interviewer or a boss and they ask you, how did you get the best of these 3 months? What is your answer? Once you have written down your answer, what are you going to do in the next 5 days to work towards that answer? And if people work towards that answer, they stop moving from thinking about what could have been to what they can do in the next 5 days. And here reference points coming. Your reference points could be backward reference points, which is, I could have gone for a summer vacation. Why did this happen in the year in which I was graduating? I was due for a promotion. Your reference point can be what might have been, and that is a negative reference point. A positive reference point is an aspirational reference point, which you are moving towards, not too far, so that loss aversion kicks in and you have an intensity. And again, if you have a 3-month target, doesn't work, translate a 3-month target into a 5-day target and a 10-day target. So we've looked at first some principles about how we should communicate in crisis. The second thing I want to look at is again a question, which is that if you look across the world, you find that a large number of countries underestimated the crisis. And a large number of developed countries underestimated the crisis. You have the case of Boris Johnson, who went public and said, I'm still shaking hands. And of course, that backfired spectacularly on him. So why did many underestimate the threat? And the answer is very, very simple, that people often underestimate the threat of very low probabilities. And there are two things that happen. So if I tell you that there is a 0.01% chance that you will die from COVID, that itself is low. Now I go out and I meet 5 people in different settings. And I do that 4 times. Nothing happens to me. Nothing happens to the 5 people. My mental probability drops even further. So human beings create subjective probabilities. They don't go by objective numbers. And subjective probabilities are weighed by salience. You know, there is this famous example that if you ask people, what are you more likely to die from? A shark attack or being hit by parts falling from a crashing aeroplane? Okay, so if you look at the statistics, people are more likely to die from parts falling from a crashing aeroplane. But if you look at what people say, most people say shark attack, despite the fact that you may have lived in India and never seen a shark in your life. But the point is, there is a movie called Jaws 1, there is a movie called Jaws 2, there is a movie called Jaws 3. Many of us have seen the movies, many of us have thought about shark attacks, so the salience is high. The second is, you can talk about exponential growth, but you can't see it. So there is this famous example. I was reading an interview with Danny Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize, and he's a behavioral economist. And he was due to travel to France. And he was due to travel to France at a point in time where France had 100 COVID cases. And Daniel Kahneman says, I'm a behavioral economist. I study this stuff. I know about exponents. But when I looked at my air ticket, I said there are only 100 cases and I'm flying 15 days from now. It should be okay. He said, if I had sat down and done the math, I would have realized that 100 today with exponents and doubling means 100,000 in a month. So the power of exponentiation is something that we do not realize when the numbers are small, and therefore we underreact to it. The third is there are many students here, people here who are students of branding, perception, marketing. The fact that we call it a virus. Virus is a familiar word. We've lived through viruses before. We've survived them. It's okay. Nothing will happen. And it's an unseen threat. It's not like a terrorist threat. It's not like somebody is going to bomb us. It's not like we're going to war. Those are tangible threats. So we tend to underestimate the effect of the intangible. It is only through repetition. It is only through tangible action. And yes, when famous people started getting infected, it made it far more serious for many of us. The fact that Tom Hanks was infected, the fact that Boris Johnson. So now there were people you knew who were suffering, and it was not this impossible threat which you could kind of underestimate. I'm going to move forward because one of the biggest challenges today, and I love this example. It says that, many people in countries don't pay tax. Supposing 10% of the population does not pay tax, and you're one of the population who pays tax. Does it bother you that 10% of the population doesn't pay tax? Of course it should bother you. It doesn't bother you too much because life goes on. It doesn't really affect your life. You're paying your taxes and going on. Now, we say 10% of the population does not comply with social distancing. Does it bother you? Because when you are looking at network effects, the dangers of non-cooperation are very, very high. And the first point is related. You are really trying to get people to do something because a number of young people who take the stance that we are not the most vulnerable. Most people below the age of 30 who get COVID are going to survive. They will be sick for a few days and they will be fine. And if those people are insecure, if those people have their economic survival threatened, they will not think of others And if they don't think of others, they're going to make some really, really bad choices. Okay, I'm going to go to two more slides. One is that how do you create more giving behavior in these kind of crises? And there is something called the identifiable victim effect. So this is the story of 1987 of a baby called baby Jessica, who was trapped in a well. And the photos went in all the newspapers. She was covered. And when the fireman came to pull her out of the well, it went on the cover of Time magazine. Baby Jessica came out, and $1.2 million of voluntary donations were received, and she was taken care of for the rest of her life. Of course, she was okay by then, but she was taken care of. So that is the kind. Now, the point is that if you tell people that 10,000 people get trapped in wells every year, we want money to save them, it does not lead to that kind of giving behavior. But if you give me one face with one story, then it leads to giving behavior. So actually the data shows that with the number of people you report getting affected, the giving behavior goes down. But the number of people who are relatable, a small number of people, relatable story, because giving decisions are emotional decisions. I'm going to close with one last slide, and I think this sums up a lot of things, and I will take questions. There is a key here. The slide is talking about BR, which is the range of human behaviors. And think of a range of human behaviors from passive, non-social to active, highly social. So passive, non-social is sitting alone and watching Netflix for 3 hours. At the opposite end, watching an IPL match with 10,000 people in a stadium. Now, if you look at a period BC, BC is the period before Corona. So before Corona, there was a range of behaviors. During Corona, that range of behaviors has shrunk because a large number of behaviors has been denied to us. Now, what the slide says that we do not know how human beings are going to go. What is clear is that the day after Corona, not all behaviors will be permitted. We will not permit big gatherings. We will have some social distancing norms. The number of behaviors will go forward a little bit, but there will come a time when we say the danger is over and there is a new normal. The danger will never completely be over. There will be a new normal with some modifications. But the point is, it is then up to us as human beings, whether we become person A, person B, person C. Now, person A is a person who in this time has sat up late in the night and binge watched for 4 hours every day. And the problem is some of these passive habits may persist. So the point in this is that if you are looking individually, person C is the extreme. He misses the social interaction. So he goes out to restaurants 5 times, goes out to parties. And person C also is a bit of a problem because you might just have another relapse and another lockdown coming out of that. So one of the implications for all of us is we have to decide what habits we want to change, what habits we want to keep. And this is a large opportunity for us to discover and create habit change positively for each of us. So I have 3 kind of final takeaways, and then I will open to some questions. And I have 2 slides, which is like my final story. What habits will you create today which you want to make permanent? And let's say I want to exercise more. When I say baby steps, it says don't say I'm going to lose so much weight. Say I'm going to exercise for 20 minutes tomorrow at 7 o'clock. Create an intention statement. Every day you do that, tick it off. When you've done that for 7 days, you are giving yourself control. Control reduces learned helplessness, and then your identity changes. You have moved from I should exercise to I exercise regularly. And I exercise regularly is a change in identity. Change in identity brings change in habit. I've already talked about the interview question, but the final thing is I think it's useful to say what habits do we need to change, both as an individual and as a society. There are many companies which are talking to me about 75% people will work from home, particularly in the IT sector in the future. The point is you have to make work from home desirable, because otherwise the question will be, is it that the 25% who are allowed to work from office are inherently superior or more valued by the organization? And if that is the stance that you take, then you will never get people wanting to work from home. So how do you position work from home for habit change if that is what you decide? No place where that's more valuable than Bombay. Because if you are able to implement work from home, you can add 3 hours of quality life to many people's lives. Because the 3 hours in commuting will be saved, pollution will go down. Some of us will be able to get a better view from, the view from the home will go up. Environment will be safer for the kids. So these are my final takeaways. I will stop the share. I have 2 more slides I will show right at the end, but I will do that after taking some questions.
Sure. So, Ranjan sir, I'll just quickly ask you first the COVID-related questions, perhaps, and then a few personal and business-related. So, on the COVID-related, the first one we had from Pranav was seeing the USA situation. What are the different behavioral economics concepts do you see playing out in terms of whether do you choose to save lives or do you choose to save the economy?
See, the problem is that that balance is very difficult to strike. Whether you choose to save lives or choose to save the economy, the problem is within a country like India, if the mechanism you choose to save lives is going to be a lockdown and a strong lockdown, then the danger is at some point in time, you will take more lives because of economic reasons than you will save through lockdowns. So the answer is that this is a balance. And this is a balance that needs to be addressed gradually. And I think our government is going about it pretty much in a sensible way. But what you will have to look at is really a dynamic algorithm. And there was this lovely line that I read that maybe can help you, which is to say that historically, if you look at our organizations, our systems are designed for efficiency. Okay, what does that mean? I want to make exactly as much as I want. We talk about just in time. We talk about plants producing just to meet demand. We talk about low wastage. We have to use a concept in ecology which says we need to move from designing systems for efficiency to designing systems for resilience. Because think of it, if you have 5 factories and you have a large part of the country in green and some parts of the country in red, if all of your factories are in the red zone, you may not be able to service demand despite the fact that you have demand. So designing a system for resilience implicitly implies some inefficiency, but a greater flexibility. So I think the answer to that lies in the balance. I don't think anybody has a correct answer, but in general, where the leader's sense of denial has been a little bit lower, the country has done well. Where the leader has communicated well. In fact, one of the things I would recommend to everybody is go and see, I don't know how her name is pronounced, Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand. Okay, just go and see her speeches, go and see the way she communicates. Absolutely specific, absolutely on point, very, very transparent with great dates. I would also say our Prime Minister, irrespective of your political affiliation, I don't want to get into that, his communication is excellent. It's very well planned, it's very well thought through. And I know there has been some criticism of the banging of pots and pans and the lights and all of that, but getting people to do something collectively is a very good idea, because it moves us from thinking about ourselves to thinking about others, and that is something that you need to get. In fact, what behavioral economics would say in this case is, don't just talk about now how many people are dying, but say, imagine that you have an elderly person in your family. Think of that elderly person. You are staying at home and we are staying at home so that your parents and mine are safer. Now, suddenly that is a more effective communication because that is an identifiable person. So when you are looking at your behavior in terms of an identifiable person, then this.
Sure. So Ranjan sir, the second one on this was more as an application for reference point that somebody commented that since COVID-19 hit US and Europe first and they affected them badly, was it responsible for setting a reference point for India, and so they managed to take it more seriously on the first onset itself?
I think that is possible. I think that is possible. You must also, I think, give our government credit that I think we stopped travel from China way before other people did. So I think it is a combination of we saw what was happening in other countries and acted, but I think due to some combination of both the economic state of India as well as some actions that were taken, we were less vulnerable to China. The second is, I think we had a strong leader. And I think it was a decisive move. The lockdown came in early, and by and large, we have been able to implement. But again, when you see violations of the lockdown, understand that there are 2 or 3 levels of violations of lockdown. One level of violation of lockdown is people who are economically insecure. They will violate. Why? Because if I am economically insecure and my survival is threatened, I don't think of others. I think of myself, and I think irrationally of myself. The second is religion. To the highly religious, and I'm not talking about any religion here, religion is a higher purpose than life and living. Therefore, it is not enough to say don't have religious congregation. The religious leaders must be speaking to their followers and say, how can you practice religion while at home? It is not enough to say, don't do this, you must give me an alternative behavior, otherwise habits will not change sustainably.
Sure. So another one was on the lockdown and how you spoke about the Prime Minister is using some concepts to probably announcing the lockdown one by one. So there was one that if the original anchor point is changed too many times, you just stop believing the anchor point. So probably you can enlighten us some more on what could be the probable reason that we are going it in this manner.
So I think, and this is not really anchoring. Anchoring happens when we have very limited information, and the only information we have is the anchor. So this is not really anchoring because there is a huge amount of information. What I think the government is trying to do is that if the government comes and tells you that we are locked down, I don't know how long we are going to be locked down, so please bear with me. It is very difficult to handle. So the government is saying, I'm going to do it for 15 days. I'm going to take stock and then tell you what happens next. And each time there is something that they are relaxing. So what they are trying to do is relax this in a way that there is no explosion of adverse behaviors, so that when you do relax and when you do move to decisions that have economic impact, because the problem is that, let us say you come out, you say today, tomorrow is the new normal, you can go back to your workplaces, and the cases start growing and your hospitals are overflowing, then you'll have to lock down all over again. And the economic impact will be worse. So this is a case of timing. Nobody knows the timing exactly. So it's a wait and watch and communicate. Now that's a judgment call. I don't think we can judge it, but I don't think this is anchoring. This is a question of repeatedly shifting reference points. So right now your reference point has shifted from lockdown to red, blue, green. If you're in an academic institution, we are now being given tangible dates like July 1st and August 1st. And that again gives us a reference point for us to plan forward. If we told you campus is going to reopen, but we don't know when, that is one kind of scenario. Vis-a-vis campus is going to reopen, we think it's going to be August 1st and we are preparing for August 1st. That still gives people something to predict, right? So I think the answer is you want to do things in a way that gives people some sense of control. A lack of control is what creates negativity, it creates helplessness, and then the people become part of the problem. Because then what will happen is that you will have an outpouring, and the outpouring will be sudden and the relapse will be geometrical. So that's what we are trying to avoid.
Great. So I'll move to the other kind of questions which were mostly personal or business related. So how can you use these principles in managing a team? So probably you spoke about on the performance evaluation example. Some other examples or any other situation wherein while managing a team, these concepts that we just saw help us or come in play?
So I'll give you one simple one. In most of our teams, we talk about collaboration, but we set key result areas and incentives that are completely individual. So the first thing is align your explicit and implicit behaviors with the way you want people to behave. So let us say you're in a team, ask yourself, what behaviors do I want? Is it 60% competitive, 40% collaborative? Then ask yourself, is there a team incentive for collaboration? Do my incentives support the behaviors I want to make? I think that is one very simple thing. The second implication of behavioral economics is that you want to make desired behaviors tangible. So essentially, if you as a manager are not demonstrating the behaviors that you want your team to take, they will not follow. People follow what leaders do, they do not follow what leaders say. This is there in the HR literature, but it is a very obvious behavioral economics thing that if you want, understand habit change is very difficult. Habit change does not happen dramatically overnight. You have to find out incremental steps that you want your team to make. And over that incremental steps, you change the identity of your team over a period of time. So incentives are one, habit change is the third, second, demonstration is the third. Fourth is if you want a culture, you have to demonstrate the culture. Very, very simple thing. Let's say you're in a team meeting and you say, I want to hear every voice. Very, very simple thing to hear every voice. The leader should speak last. Okay, because otherwise what happens in India, because the organizations are hierarchical, if you are the third person to speak, the person from the fourth person onwards says, as our leader had said. And that's how the communication starts. The second is there are introverts and extroverts in teams. I found it very useful that if you want to hear the ideas of everybody in the team, get them to write down their thoughts before they speak. Because otherwise what happens is that the first person who speaks influences what everybody else says. In fact, in happier times, if a group of people goes out to order drinks, you all know this, right? That the first two orders of drinks dramatically influence what is ordered by everybody else after that. So in team decision making, choices are not rational because there are a lot of peer effects. So if you want brainstorming, if you want everybody's view, how do you get rid of peer effects and demand effects? And one of the simple tools is get people to write before they speak, because then they are obliged to share their own thinking with the larger group.
Great, great. So I'll just take one final question in the interest of time, which is, I think a couple of people asked, what are the recommended reading from your side if you want to know more about the subject, if you could name a few?
So the simple book is Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely. I'll just type it as I'm speaking. If you've read a little bit about the subject, the best book is a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, whom I talked about when I talked about the flight to France. But what I would also say is that all of these guys have podcasts and blogs, and you can follow their podcasts and blogs if you're not the book reading type. So books are one, but even you're just a video type, everybody has a TED Talk, you can listen to the TED Talk. And I would use behavioral economics by running small experiments inside companies. We are doing a lot of that with many companies. If people are interested in research using behavioral economics within your companies, that's something we'd be open to. So, Soumya, I had two quick slides for kind of a kicker. Can I do that? It's just
Sure,
a one.
sure.
It's just a 1 minute. So, final thing. Quick question. How many animals of each kind did Moses take on the ark? Quick question. Don't think fast. Don't think too much. Put down your estimate. How many animals of each kind did Moses take on the ark? Okay, Moses didn't take any animals on the ark, Noah did. Okay, so the point is that many people start thinking about the number of animals because Moses is biblical and the ark is biblical and the statement seems to make sense. So you don't process it and you're under pressure of time. So as you see, these behavioral economics, the kind of mistakes are mistakes we all make. We can become aware of our mistakes and do things. And we must also become aware that this is the way our consumers process information. So some behavioral economics principles in the way we design choices, in the way we design promotion, in the way we communicate are all things that are possible. It's been great fun. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it. It's quite remarkable to see 253 people still at the webinar on Saturday. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, Ranjan sir. Thank you. And with that, everybody, we close the session. Thank you so much for joining in. I just want to point out, we can see the feedback in the comment section and how people are very happy to attend the session. So I would like to thank the alumni committee and the alumni relations office for organizing this, because it really is giving us chance to us alums to actually come back to the classroom. I think it is a very, very interesting way of interacting with the alumni. Guys, just in case you have not joined the WhatsApp groups that exist for the alumni in whichever city probably you're sitting in, please do that. Please keep checking your emails. We have another webinar organized next Saturday, same time, by Professor Surya Tahora, which is on the topic staying centered in the midst of a storm. which is again a very, very relevant topic given the situation we are in. So do tune in for that webinar as well. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you, Ritika
Please
ma'am.
stay healthy. Thank you.